Hi, how are y'all? Good? Okay, great. So this evening's symposium is on diversifying artificial intelligence. And I thought we'd just start off by, I'd love to show, get one or two examples from the audience of when, even better. So I'm not going like this. When was the first time you noticed artificial intelligence in your own life? Anyone want to share? No one? Okay, I'll start off. And maybe this will prompt one of you to think about how it was related. I was in the car with my family, and we were talking about going to the movies. And I actually looked down and looked at my Facebook and realized that the movie we were talking about, all of a sudden I received all this information in my Facebook ads related to that movie. And I was like, I just opened up Facebook. I wasn't on Facebook. How did they know what I was talking about? So I started talking to some of my friends and going, have you ever noticed that Facebook knows what you're talking about, even if you haven't ever searched it? And they're like, oh, yeah. And the reason why is because of the microphone. Sometime down in history, I had approved an in-app of Facebook, and it required microphone. And so automatically, it opens up your settings to allow for the microphone to be on there. And if Facebook is ever in the background when your phone is on, it can record up to 15 seconds of what you're saying because you've given it permission. Even perhaps you might not have known that, but you've given permission.
Is everyone going to pull out their phone now?
Yeah, people are totally going to pull out their phone. And so this kind of like anonymous aggregated information is actually trying to help personalize the experience. So to an extent, that's great, right? I was getting a personalized something I'm interested in, getting it shared to me. But at the same time, the way these in-apps are approved, we're easily approve them, we're not really looking deeply or critically thinking about what type of information we're willing to share back to these systems. So that's one example. Does anyone else want to share an example of AI in their lives? No? Okay, well, I'm going to definitely put all three of you on the spot. Oh, wait. Oh, Amara, yes.
Forgotten that I searched for something, and then it pops up on my Amazon feed saying that I was interested in it. So I think that's one example of everyday life.
Yeah, very good example, too, especially if you share Amazon with your children, and all of a sudden you're like, I didn't realize I was interested in that toy. Maybe for Christmas, right? Yeah, exactly. Those are two really good examples, and these are examples of where I think what's important about having this symposium today is it's actually at the end of National Media Literacy Week, which has been going on this entire week to get everyone in the United States and beyond critically thinking about the media we're consuming and participating in. And AI is the new media that is really part of our everyday lives. It actually encompasses how we live, how we work, how we drive, and even actually kind of our social and cultural norms are now a part of it, which we're going to talk about today. So in this, we're going to not only explain to you, for those of you who might not know what artificial intelligence is, these wonderful panelists will help us understand that. How we interact with them, like these two examples we've shared, why they matter, and where are the ethical implications and concerns that you should be aware of and critically inquire about, especially with regards to diversity and inclusion. So let me introduce you to our panelists. I'm going to start at the end and work my way back. Flynn Coleman is with Melina and NYU Law. She's an international human rights attorney. An educator, an author, a public speaker, and a social entrepreneur and innovator. So welcome, Flynn. She's spoken about artificial intelligence and humanity from TEDx to Atlanta Symphony Hall. She is also an ethical fashion designer, a mindfulness, innovation, and creativity teacher, a social justice activist, a former competitive athlete, and the founder and CEO of Milena. You rock. Flynn's also the founding fellow at the Grunin Center for Law and Social Entrepreneurship at NYU School of Law. She has a background in innovative approaches to economic development, international trade law, war crimes, genocide, behavioral economics, political reconciliation, post-conflict justice, artificial intelligence, and improving access to justice through innovation. She has spoken, written, and taught extensively on issues of global justice, social enterprise, social impact, human rights, artificial intelligence, storytelling, redefining success, and the future of work, purpose, technology, and humanity. So we are excited to have Flynn join us. Thank you, Flynn.
And now I'm going to go rewrite my bio. I'll be back in a few minutes.
Oh no, all of you rock here. So before I put you off the hot seat, Flynn, can you share with us an example of first time you recognized AI was a part of your life?
Yes. Is this thing on? Hello. So I just want to say something I think is really interesting. I'm going to share, and it's very similar to what you said, but we'll probably kind of get into this more. But there's something that's specific to AI called the AI effect, which is where the second something has become AI, artificial intelligence, we decide it's actually no longer learning on its own, it's no longer AI. So we'll discuss why that's so and kind of the control and fear that goes along with this, that indeed an AI is invented, but when it becomes a Netflix or a Google and so ingrained in our lives, we said, no, that's not AI, that's not thinking for us, even though of course it is. So just to kind of right off the bat start thinking about why the second that happens, we decide it's actually not an AI anymore. It's just a thing we use every single day. So I have a very similar, Netflix and Amazon, I think, are perfect examples of how I thought it was just, a coincidence. I'm talking about this movie and now it's being recommended to me. And so I remember that moment where I kind of switched from realizing it's not a coincidence at all. And not only that, the movie that I'm selecting on Netflix or what I'm picking to buy on Amazon actually was selected for me and that I didn't select it. And that I let Google think for me, I let Netflix think for me, and I thought this isn't a coincidence at all. So I think that's a really interesting shift, and I've had it for Netflix, for Amazon, the ads following me around, but when I realized this isn't a coincidence at all, Netflix has just chosen my next movie, my next career, my next this, my next that. So I think that we can.
The question is did you watch it though?
And the answer a lot of times is yes. Oh, I forgot I needed those shoes. Oh, I forgot I wanted to watch that movie. So that's the thing. It's kind of inciting us to take action and selecting things for us. Yet, why don't we want to say it's thinking for us? Mm-hmm. And I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Great, thank you. So we have Michelle Ferrier from Ohio University and Trollbusters. Is the founder of Trollbusters, a service for women journalists who are targets of online harassment. The service recently launched a bot to help journalists navigate online harassment, and she is the 2017 South by Southwest Dewey Winbird Community Service Award recipient for her work with Trollbusters. That's amazing. Ferrier, I'm spelling Ferrier. Oh, I said it right the first time.
You did.
Ferrier experienced harassment as a former columnist with a Florida newspaper and as a developer of online communities for commercial and nonprofit organizations. She has spoken about online harassment at the United Nations, the European Commission, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Online News Association, and other professional venues. She is the past president of Journalism That Matters, a nonprofit organization that hosts breakthrough conversations on the emerging media landscape and community engagement, and the designer of the Create or Die series of startup workshops. I love that title, Create or Die. Ferrier is an associate professor at the E.W. Scripps School of Journalism at Ohio University. We're so glad to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, Michelle, tell us, when was the first time you recognized AI in your lives or had it thinking for you?
Yes. Well, Erin told us she was going to ask this question, and I said, there's just no way I can
You're not
ask my
skipping.
brain far back and think about that. But I did want to bring up an example of kind of how big data and algorithms are used in our daily lives, and we don't even think about it and the kinds of effects that it has. Back in the day when there was Kodak and there was film that was made, that software and the way they processed the film was designed around a particular image of a white Caucasian woman. And so when African Americans would send their film off in a little envelope in the quaint old days and wait to get their pictures back, the color was just not calibrated for our skin. Fast forward to today, I travel a lot. And in a lot of airports, and all of them seem to want to have magical toilets these days. I don't know why. They want to flush before you're done. But the hands, they're not quite calibrated to my body. But when you go to wash your hands, the automatic faucets, they weren't turning on. And I'd wave my hands, and I'd do all of these things. They weren't calibrated to read my skin. And so the water wouldn't turn on. And so you can see how the kind of past is present in the same kinds of technologies as we design these tools to supposedly be smart for us. Here I was struggling to try and get the water to work because it couldn't recognize my skin color. So just an ordinary thing that you wouldn't think about, but obviously has some significant effects on hygiene.
Right, exactly. We do want you to wash your hands.
I do, a lot.
So Susan, I love being on a panel with you again. This is amazing. So Susan Ettlinger is an industry analyst at Altimeter. Her research focuses on the impact of artificial intelligence, data, and advanced technologies on business and culture, and is used in university curricula around the world. Susan's TED Talk, which if you haven't seen, you gotta watch, "What Do We Do with All This Big Data?" has been translated into 25 languages and has been viewed more than 1 million times, and hopefully about 1,100,000 more after tonight. She is a sought-after keynote speaker and has been quoted in media outlets including the Wall Street Journal, BBC, and New York Times. Welcome, Susan. Thank you. So tell us, Susan. You know the question.
I kind of feel like we've covered it. We covered my Netflix example, so I was like, all right, fine. And then Michelle did the Shirley card.
Yes, the Shirley card.
The Shirley card, which is basically, Shirley card looked pretty much like me about 25 years ago. But, so one day I was messing around because part of my job entails like playing with really stupid apps. So I was playing around with Facetune. You guys ever try Facetune? You know what the deal is with Facetune? It's got facial recognition in it, so it knows where your eyes are and your lips are and everything else. And I realized as I was looking at it, I'm like, I think I'm just putting like funny fake eyelashes on myself, but in fact, I'm training this data on where my eyes are, what my eyes look like, what color my eyes are, and somewhere there's a big old server farm with a whole bunch of information about what faces look like, which is admittedly really crap for people of color, and also certainly Asians as well, Asian folks, because these things tend to be trained on a so-called norm of what people look like. And so this is just, I can't escape it. I just feel like it's constantly in my face, this issue around diversity, not just gender diversity, but all kinds of diversity, which I know, Erin, you're going to talk about. So that's my story.
Great, thank you. Okay, so just to give you an idea, this is an hour-long panel. And how it's going to work is all three of our panelists are going to have 5 minutes to present some of their work, kind of do a deep dive into some of the core subjects around diversifying artificial intelligence. And then I have a few questions prepared, or maybe a lot of questions, but we're not going to get to all of them. That's a blog post for next steps. I always like next steps. And then get your questions ready because there are many ways for you to participate with us. You can just raise your hand and we'll have a microphone going around. If you're following us on Facebook Live, you can post a question there and we'll make sure to get to answer a few of those or just tweet it to us and you've got you'll see up here all of our Twitter handles, and we'll get those questions answered. So whether you're behind the scenes wanting to not raise your hand or stepping up in front right here, we will want you to join the conversation. So there are hashtags as well, gender gap and AI diversity. So if you are posting things, please make sure to share those, as well as at Media Literacy Ed, so that it can be part of the national media literacy conversation that's happening this week. Okay? So let's get started. Susan, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Okay. We're going to have slides? Yeah. Okay. Here we go. Look. Okay, so before you start talking about artificial intelligence, it might actually be useful to talk about what human intelligence is, because I bet if I asked you all to write down your definition of intelligence of any kind, there would be as many answers, or maybe even more, than there are people in the room. So as I was doing my research for some of the reports I've been writing, I started to talk to people and say, well, what is AI? What is it? Is it machine learning? Is it the output of machine learning? Is it something else? How can we understand it? Is it killer robots? Is it, is it Blade Runner? Is it this little taco bot that I can order a taco, from Taco Bell? Like, what is it? And really, I couldn't get a consensus. And so I started thinking about, well, okay, let's go back to humans for a minute, and let's start to think about humans from a little bit more of a focused way, right? Because when you think about intelligence, I mean, there are IQ tests and all that kind of stuff, but we all know that we all have different types of intelligence. Some of us are amazing at math and computation, some of us are good at language, some of us are gifted athletes, some of us are great, in nature or emotional intelligence. And so I looked at this framework from Howard Gardner, who is now a distinguished professor at Harvard. He's a developmental psychologist. He looks at child development, and he came up with these 9 different types of intelligence. And I thought this is actually a really good way to think about the kinds of things that AI can do. Because if you think about image recognition, the stuff I was talking about before and that Michelle was talking about, that's really what he's characterized under spatial. And if you start to think about language processing and the ability to understand language such that when you say, hey, Alexa, Alexa responds to you, that lives in linguistic intelligence. And when you think about self-driving cars, those are different types of things because they're responding to images, and they're responding to movement, and they're responding to knowing where they are in the world, so, orientation. And so anyway, so that was just kind of a start. And so, there's a whole bunch of stuff, like if I were going to give a talk, I'd give you the whole spiel here. But the deal with artificial intelligence is that, you can think about it as a sort of this idea of general artificial intelligence, which is really kind of what they're getting at with Black Mirror, Westworld. You guys watching any of this stuff? Black Mirror, Westworld, Her, the movie Her, like any of the stuff that's sort of where you think about artificial intelligence emulating a person. And then there's the stuff that we're seeing sort of with every day with chatbots, with Alexa, with Siri, with suggested text in our every time you try to type, you end up typing ducking, what I'm talking about. That kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of everyday stuff, but it really isn't perfect. And so a couple of examples, with recommendation engines on the left, this is where Amazon, people were buying stuff on Amazon, and then all of a sudden they started recommending like other ingredients you could use to make a bomb. Why this happened, I don't know. The one on the right I love because it's a great way to talk about diversity. So that everybody gets it. So Volvo, based in Sweden, makes these beautiful, sturdy cars. They're testing their driverless car in Australia. And so they put it on the road in Australia, and what starts happening? Immediately it starts crashing into kangaroos. And so they took a step back and realized, like, what did we do here? Well, what they did was they created the reference point for the car is the ground. So the car is always focused in relation to the ground. Why is this? Because in Sweden, the animals that you are likely to crash into on the road are things like deer and moose and elk, and they go like this. In Australia, any 2-year-old can tell you from anywhere in the world, the most likely thing you're going to do on a road in Australia is crash into a kangaroo, and they go like this. A 2-year-old knows this, and Volvo somehow missed it in their first iteration. Now, the good news is they figured it out, and they have to change their model. But the answer to the question is, why didn't they think about it from the point of view of different kinds of movements, of different kinds of animals in the world? If they had one Australian on that engineering team, they would never have had this problem. Now, this is just one example. You can generalize it to the rest of the world. For example, around sensors in bathrooms, for example, around film, and all sorts of other places in which AI falls down. Here's an example of something that, I know it's a million words, but I'm gonna explain it, and I promise I won't use any math. So the way that you train a set of data in order to understand language is you use this thing called a data set, and there's this data set that's called Word2Vec, which basically is made up of all the words in 30 million Google News stories. And that's used to train things like recommendation engines and search engine algorithms and things like that, so that when you type something in the box, it says, oh, you might like these other things. Like, so it's the kind of stuff that Netflix uses, it's the kind of stuff that tons of apps that you use or websites that you use uses. So a couple of researchers from Microsoft and Boston University went to do a deep dive into Word2Vec, and what did they find out? That they called it, in their words, blatantly sexist. And it was because they use this very advanced kind of, all right, I lied, I'm gonna talk about math for a second. But they use this very advanced kind of mathematics, which I don't understand, called vector space mathematics. But the point is, it sort of works by identifying what they call word embeddings, which is clusters of words that are associated with each other. Think of it as like an analogy. Tokyo is to Japan as Paris is to France. Except what did they find? Man is to programmer as woman is to homemaker. And if you look at these lists on the left and on the right, it shows you the words that are most associated with men in terms of professions, like maestro, skipper, protege, philosopher, captain, architect, and the ones that are most associated with women. This, by the way, this happens with image training too. So data and algorithms aren't perfect and pristine. They encode all of our biases, whether we know we have them or not. So here's the big news. I'm sure you've all heard about all the Russian hacking allegations and Facebook and everything else, like everybody else has. But one thing happened on Facebook or on Twitter a couple weeks ago that was really significant, which is that Alex Stamos, who's the chief security officer, kind of went on a wild rampage. And he did this tweet storm in which this tweet showed up in the middle. And he was talking about why, basically, he was being defensive, basically saying, we know what the problem is, we're trying to solve it, et cetera, et cetera. But what he ends up saying, well, sorry about all the double negatives, is nobody at the big companies doesn't know that algorithms aren't neutral. Everybody knows this. Now, he's talking about Google, Microsoft, Facebook, et cetera. But you know what? The rest of the world doesn't know this. And it's really important that you all know that algorithms are not neutral. And this is why we need history, and this is why we need philosophy and everything else, because we need to understand what the history of the past is so we don't kind of repeat it even more quickly and efficiently using algorithms. But the good news is we can learn. So in Boston, there was this app called Street Bump. You drive over it. If there's a pothole in the road, it clocks it, shows where you are, sends a message to your local government. Super cool, right? Except in order for it to work, you need a smartphone. You need a data plan that isn't like crazy expensive. You're probably driving to work by yourself. So guess what? You're probably wealthy, or at least you're probably pretty affluent. So instead of just clocking the potholes in a city, it's actually clocking the potholes in the wealthy areas of the city, which is a problem. So they figured this out. They got the data back. They realized they were only seeing data from the wealthy neighborhoods, so they gave the app to the sanitation engineers, the bus drivers, the paramedics, and all that kind of stuff. And so then they started getting data from the rest of the city. So one other example, because this is a fun one, you've probably all heard of predictive policing, which is super, super problematic for many, many reasons. Predictive policing basically looks at where the area is most likely to have crime so that police departments can send resources there. Shockingly, they tend to be in neighborhoods that are neighborhoods with people of color. This project actually showed what happens when you flip it. This is about where, and this is real data, by the way, where can you find instances of white-collar crime? And what is the, because they were profiling people, right? What does a white-collar criminal look like? Here you go. This is what a white-collar criminal looks like according to the algorithm. So, there are ways to kind of flip the script, and I'm hoping that that's some of the things that you guys will be looking at in the next couple days. I'm just gonna go through this because I've taken more time than I should, but I think it's really important to have some principles to work from. So the first is it should be useful, AI, right? It should be respectful and empathetic to people, use their data wisely, be respectful to them as people. It should be trustworthy, right? We should know when we're dealing with it. It should be fair, meaning it doesn't cause disparate impact to certain groups over others. And then finally, it should be accountable so that it can get fixed and we can have processes in place. So this is part of a report that's coming out next week. If you want it, you should give me an email or we'll send it out or something like that. But anyway, plenty more to say. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Susan. Great, thank you. Michelle. Came on for a little bit.
So I'm glad Susan's provided some context because I'm going to dive very deeply into a very dark topic. I live in a very dark world on the dark web, the underside and underbelly of most of the pretty stuff you see on the top side. And so I run Trollbusters, which is online pest control for women writers. Just to give you some context into the background of this work, just on Twitter alone, 27% of women have said that they've experienced hate speech, sexist, racist, homophobic speech, and 22% that said they've experienced doxing, which is the release of private information. What we do at Trollbusters is really try and interrupt the cycle of abuse that happens online, and we do that in a couple of different ways. One, we have an SOS team that looks at countering those attacks. So when somebody reports to us that they're being harassed online, we engage in a couple of things. One is sending positive messages. I'll share a little bit about that, and providing some coaching on what they should do next. We also use monitoring tools, social media monitoring tools to monitor both the target and the troll. Because if you're a troll, you're probably trolling other people. And we use that as a way to be able to find out who else you might be attacking and be able to support and help them. And then we also work with a suite of colleagues who do technical support, legal support, psychological support, et cetera, to be able to help you move past or at least manage the attacks online. So to give you a little bit of the sense of the work that we do, about a year ago, we started actively monitoring what we call the Pilot 100, 100 women journalists from across the country. What you're seeing on this monitor, how many of you saw the new Ghostbusters movie? Okay, so few of you. Okay, it didn't play as well here. So the Ghostbusters movie, as some of you know, all-female cast, got trolled even before the movie came out because it was an all-female cast. And all of the actresses that played in the movie ended up getting some kind of abuse. But Leslie Jones, who played was the African-American in that cast of women, received the most hate. And probably in the time that I've been monitoring social media over the past 2 years since we developed Trollbusters, probably one of the most severe cases that I've seen. Not only did she receive hate messages, but in the height of when the movie had come out, they'd actually taken down her website. So they did a denial of service attack on her website, brought her website down, hacked her cloud, pulled out naked pictures of her, replaced those on her website, put her website back up so everybody else could see them, put out personal information on her. So almost all of the kinds of tactics that we see, usually in isolation, they managed to pretty much throw the book at her in terms of what happened. But what you see here on this monitor, you see kind of the red on the left-hand side, and then you see a bunch of pluses, green pluses on the right-hand side. And this is some of the sentiment analysis, the machine learning going on in the background, looking at and reading these tweets, looking at clusters of words, etc., and tagging them as positive or negative. In this particular example, because she had a huge fan base, once they replaced her website and she was under siege to the point where she jumped off off Twitter for a pretty long time before she came back to do the Olympics. But she jumped off of Twitter. But what you see is her fan base coming to her rescue. These were people that started a hashtag Love for Leslie J and used that as a way to rally support. And you can actually see that in the monitors as we're looking at machine learning, helping us understand what's happening in the environment. So what we learned is that the kinds of activities that we've seen specifically against women journalists or journalists of color, those are the two groups that we see most. I get the most harassment online, is that speed is an issue. The kinds of behaviors that we see are not behaviors, they're behaviors that have existed for a very long time. Think back to the beginning of journalism when women were jumping into that space. They used pseudonyms, they used men's names, they used initials to be able to mask their identities so that they could be protected in physical space. We don't have that now. Our organizations, our media organizations are asking us to be transparent, to be online and engage with our audiences in a way where there's a real blurring of the public and private spaces of the lives of journalists. So we try and interrupt this cycle, the speed, the smart mobs that are engaging in this kind of activity online with just-in-time education, coaching, and learning to support women to move forward. This past year, recognizing, as we began to recognize the dynamics of what was happening online, that we had to interrupt as quickly as possible. We couldn't wait for you report to me, I report back to you and get permission to operate in your stream. We really needed to be able to operate more quickly. And we decided to really break down into a topology of the types of threats that journalists experience online and then help them through a flowchart navigate what the next steps might be that they should take in order to be able to move forward, whether it's reporting it to a colleague, turning over your social media keys, reporting it to management or the police. And so what that means is on social media that we're using those very same visuals to push those out in real time so that people will report to us and we'll be able to assist them very quickly. Most recently, we've created a chatbot. Because we recognized the speed in which we needed to act, we needed something even faster than just online education in the way that we might be able to even put that in front of people. And so we used the chatbots and basically broke down this same infographic into a chatbot. So we ask, are you being harassed online? What kind of harassment are you experiencing? Okay, here are the steps that you might want to pursue next. So we take people through a decision tree to help them be effective and in action around the things that are happening to them right now. And so here's a sample of the Trollbusters chatbot that lives on our Facebook page. We are in beta testing right now. We launched at ONA this past month, actually, and are encouraging people to take a look at it, break it for us, let us know where we can be more friendly and helpful in terms of the content that we're producing. As we mentioned, this is not just a US problem. It is a problem that's happening globally. And in fact, we as journalists here in the US have operated under a free press for the most part. We've operated under freedom of expression for the most part. In other countries where they don't have those kinds of protections in their constitution, we often see journalists who not only are threatened online, but may result in jailings, spurious lawsuits, as well as murders that happen around the world. And so other countries are looking at solutions to be able to deal with and protect their journalists, whether they're at home, whether they're fighting and reporting from a war front, or whether they're doing a stand-up in their own backyard. We've translated our work into Spanish as well as Hindi, and are looking at translating it into Russian and Ukrainian. You might be able to guess why. Quite a few trolls coming out of troll farms in Russia. And so that's a little bit of an inkling into the work that we do and why we do it and how you do it. And I think as we move forward in designing around this, it's really using the appropriate tool for the job. And we found that in order to be most responsive, even if we had the best monitoring systems, we needed to be more responsive, because we found when we operate in somebody's stream and we start from the beginning, we are able to diminish the effects. We're able to diminish the pile-on effect of smart mobs jumping into their stream, and we're able to help preserve their reputation online. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. It's wonderful. Flynn.
So thank you so much to everyone who's invited us here. It's such an honor. And I'm going to have us take a little bit of a step back. We had such a beautiful kind of deep dive right away into kind of what the stakes are. And so I'm just going to have us kind of step back and set the scene, whether you're part of the hackathon or whether you're a professor or student joining us, to start to think about kind of the crossroads that we're at and what it means. So I'm an international human rights lawyer, and I study the intersection of technology and humanity. So what is the future of humanity? What is the future of human rights? What is the future of technology? And the reason I do that is because when I kind of stepped back and thought about the issues that were going to most shape humanity and human rights in the future, I kept coming back to technology, and particularly AI. And Erin has an incredible set of questions lined up for us to really start to dive into what that means. But I just want you to kind of consider for a moment that we are at a tipping point. We are at a crossroads, and we are at a point where we need to think about not just how to build this stuff, but how to build it for the good. And we are at a crossroads where this is happening alarmingly fast, and these decisions need to be thought about now. And this is why these convenings, these types of discussions, are so incredibly important to be having. So we've taken kind of the biggest first step, which is coming together to have these conversations. I had a conversation about being on the forefront of media and journalism, being on the front lines. I had a conversation with a gentleman about, well, I've probably, already said a couple stereotypical things about women, but no one's a blank slate. The only thing we can do is be open and be curious and say, I might not understand, but can you tell me your point of view? Because no one is a blank slate. The AIs are not a blank slate, and neither are we. And so what I want you to consider is that we need, and this has already kind of been discussed, we need to have diverse voices. And it's not just about computer scientists. It's not just about engineers. It's about ethicists. It's about humanists. It's about people from all different fields. So regardless of what field you're in, this is about you. We need to have diverse voices across silos, particularly unrepresented groups, particularly women, period. End of story. This is the first and biggest step to making this happen. And there is a reason, this actually was already brought up, there's a reason that the digital assistants that we have, Alexa, Cortana, Siri, there's a reason that these digital assistants that are supposed to do what we tell them to do all have default what? Female voices.
The language, right? It told us that
yes, exactly.
We're assistants, we're not bosses.
Exactly. So just to, let that soak in for a moment. So what I want to tell all of you before we dive into kind of the nitty-gritty, we're going to talk about the science, the engineering, the design. These incredible panelists have already kind of teed it up for us, is that you are the future. You are our future. You are going to be building our future. And the biggest questions facing us now have to do with how we're going to build, how we're going to infuse values and ethics into the design of these intelligent machines. And we need to be having these discussions. We need to be having discussions about what my friend calls universal design, inclusive design. These are the discussions we need to have. But here's the thing, with some very kind of small exceptions, including this incredible event, you're not necessarily going to be invited to have a seat at the table. You're not necessarily going to be invited to speak your truth and to use your voice and to get a seat at the table. So guess what we're going to have to do, folks? We're going to have to insist on it, and we're going to have to take our seat at the table. Because, and I'm sure a lot of you have already experienced this already, you're not necessarily going to be invited. No one is going to pull out a chair for you. Again, this is why these convenings are so important, because it's not necessarily going to happen. And our future is being decided right now by a very, very small group of relatively, I don't even want to say relatively, homogenous group of people who are deciding what all of our future is going to be. But you are the future. And you're going to have to insist on having your own seat at the table. No one's necessarily going to hand it to you. And here's what I want to say even more than that. I want to say that you need to use your voice, and you need to speak your truth even if your voice shakes and even if you're afraid. And even if you're not 100% sure, because folks, no one is ever 100% sure about anything in this life. You need to raise your voice even if you're shaking and nervous. And here's the thing that's just as important that you need to do. Once you've used your voice and once you found that seat at the table, once you've insisted on it, demanded it, and taken it, you need to pass the mic and invite someone else to join you. A friend, someone that you don't know from an unrepresented group, someone you know who has an incredible idea who doesn't yet have a seat at the table. You need to pass the mic and you need to invite that person to come with you. Because the thing is, and I've had this discussion with this gentleman already today, we had this wonderful discussion, is that even if we're just talking about building this stuff, we're not going to crack the code without those diverse voices. There's some perfect examples that have already come up. We're not even going to be able to build this stuff to do the thing that we want to do without this background. Say, hey, this is my experience. The faucet didn't go on. And I wouldn't have known that necessarily. And I work in this field. So we need those diverse voices just to crack the code. So you need to insist on your seat at the table, and then you need to invite someone else to come with you. So what I want to do just really quickly before we dive into the questions, I want you to just take a minute to think about who is that person for you? Is it your great-grandma who was alive when women couldn't even vote? Is it a person whose TED Talk you saw you don't even know? Who is that person that you want to invite to have a seat at the table? You're working so hard in whatever field, whatever you're studying. Who is that person? So just take a second right now to think about it. You can write down who that person is. You can close your eyes just for a minute. Who is that? Who are you fighting for? Because I find when I'm tired or when I'm frustrated and when I want to give up, if I think about that person or those people, suddenly my energy is renewed. So if you go about the hackathon this weekend, if you're not part of that, if studying gets hard, if something happens, when you kind of feel frustrated or like you're not heard, you have to think about that person. So just take a minute just to think about who that is, and every time things get difficult, remember who you're fighting for. And remember why you're doing this. Because the idea is not just to build it, but to build it for the good, and we're at a tipping point, and this is happening now. So with that said, I know we're going to dive in. So I just want to say that this is the kind of the first biggest step. It's just we're coming together to have these conversations. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being curious and saying, I don't quite understand, but can we all talk about this together? So I'm so grateful to be here. I know we're going to dive in. Erin has an amazing list of questions, and I'm just honored and thrilled to be here with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Flynn. What inspiration. It's great. Definitely we're going to dive in, but just to kind of add to one last thing, you're right, this is the beginning of an amazing 3 days, and already during the reception, someone at WVU and I were talking about how it could build on and go further into startups for like a week intensive in the spring. So, and we'll talk about that. Because the great thing about hackathons is they're wonderful and you're able to ideate and really deep down fast, and then you go away. But I don't want any of you to ever feel like you're going away and this is the end, whether you're here at the symposium or at the hackathon for the next 48 hours, because you're right. This is just the beginning, and I am sure there are plenty of resources here at WVU and the other universities you're a part of that are all trying to address this issue. AI is the new media. It's the media that you really need to understand. So let's jump in. I've had some amazing examples here, but I want to start off with like a question that can be thrown to all three of you. And it goes to actually a little bit about something all of y'all talked about on we need to learn where we should actually step in and participate in AI. And I want to give you another example that came up recently. Did any of you hear about what happened earlier this year when 2 AIs were negotiating their own language at Facebook? Yeah, and if you recall, what happened? They shut it down. That's right. They shut it down. This was sensationalized to be an issue that we don't want to happen, that we don't want AI to be talking to themselves, right? And so they shut it down. And what the AI researchers pointed out, though, is that those two agents negotiating their own language helps to more quickly find solutions. So their concern, even though it was sensationalized and they shut it down because the public was starting to get really nervous about like AI talking to itself, the researchers were saying, wait a second, we can learn from them because maybe we don't have all the answers, right? So, it's a really interesting kind of catch-22 to think about for all three of you, is if this is the direction we're going, and these AI researchers and developers will eventually want them to talk to themselves. What is a certain ethical principles we should be building into the design of AI? One or two, just give me one or two ethical principles that will help to make sure that we're distributing our cognition between man and machine, and we're not leaving behind our own humanity as we let them talk amongst themselves.
I wanted to say first and foremost that Trollbusters was born at a hackathon.
Nice.
So there is life after hackathons.
Great.
For the ideas that might come forward. And I think if you're passionate about them, there's definitely the opportunity in people who are looking for solutions. I'll give you another airport example, something very recent that was really disturbing, I think within the past 2 weeks. The scanning machines at the airports have now been calibrated in many places to recognize feminine products, such that the agents will do a very personal search of your body in those areas to determine whether you are carrying through the AI. Now, if women were at the table, do you think those scanners and the algorithms would be calibrated that way? So these are the kinds of ways in which we have to balance security, personal, private things, and national security issues. And so just a simple example of ethically, one of our top level goal at Trollbusters is do no additional harm. Do no additional harm. If we're in a space and what we're doing is aggravating the situation, get out of the space, do something else. But I don't think people think about that technology isn't neutral. Algorithms and codes aren't neutral. And so when we're designing for these things, there's usually a blind spot and biases that are built into that process that lead us to the kinds of situations I see in lots of airports, which is very, very frustrating and frightening as a woman.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that kind of brilliant commentary is that, again, to step back, and so what you're talking about are these two AIs that were speaking in a language that humans couldn't understand, so Facebook shut it down. And how, what you also said, this idea that, but it helps them get to an answer faster. So part of what we're talking about is this idea of black box algorithms and moving away from one of the big kind of the big things that scares us, which is that we don't know how AI is getting to its results. And Google's CEO has said that their auto ML AI, which they call AI inception, their AI is already better at creating AI than humans are. And so, of course, this is terrifying to us for the reasons that a lot of things that we can't control are terrifying to us. So what I'll just kind of put out there is that this is inevitable, folks, that this is going to be happening. So instead of trying to figure out how to not get them to talk to each other, we need to make sure that we are encoding this idea of ethics and values into the entire infrastructure across the entire system. So that's the thing. Yes, we have reasons to be afraid, but again, the Terminator robot type scenarios, while it could happen, it's not really what we're talking about in terms of realistic ideas. We need to move away from stop trying to make the future happen and figure out how to make it a future that we all want to live in.
So transparency is one.
Mm-hmm. Transparency, and I think that one of the things that I'm seeing is there is a lot of debate about just making sure that it stays under control. To keep it under control, we're going to be fine, let's keep it under control. To move away from that binary debate and say, okay, this is happening, folks. The future will happen. How do we build a future we want to live in?
Yeah, I'm one of the things I believe in strongly is, you work in business, and as I do, and people talk about best practices. We have to learn from best practices all the time. And in AI, there are no best practices yet, but there are worst practices, and we see them in the news every single day. Every time, an ad is targeted with like really inappropriate content, every time, there's some kind of, race, gender, age, disability, issue, every time that happens, there's something we can learn from. Every time two AIs talk to each other and they shut it down, that was a PR thing. There was no real reason to do that. The big issue is the black box. The big issue is you can put stuff in, and then there's this black box, and then stuff comes out, and you don't know how it came to the conclusion. And I think the really important piece here around principles is, we have to be realistic about transparency. So meaning that we won't always know how everything works. We won't know how everything works because we have this thing called capitalism, and there's this thing called competitive advantage, and people aren't going to say what their secret sauce is. They didn't say what their secret sauce was, in this century and the century before. They're not going to do it in the future. But there are ways to start to make these things clearer. So I think it's important for us to be kind of realistic. We're not going to re-encode the way that business and government works. What we can do is make the bad stuff much more visible, because nobody wants to live in that world. Nobody wants to live in the world where you can't get a loan, where you can't get medical treatment, where you can't get rented to because there's some business and some algorithm that you're never going to get access to. I mean, it's hard enough to figure out why your credit score is the way it is. Mm-hmm. So we don't want that kind of opaque world. And so I think it's really important for all of us to just face up to the really ugly stuff that's happening and try to figure out, like, how did this happen? And a lot of times it's the simplest thing. It's not necessarily a good thing, but it's something we can learn from. So I think that's really important.
So having a seat at the table and transparency and visibility, I think, would always be on our list of ethical principles for AI. And it's interesting what you're saying, Susan, because I always I recognize the black box, and always refer back to that. I think we, as a society, if you look back on history, helped actually make it okay for black boxes to happen. And it goes back to Steve Jobs. I mean, you might love Apple, but in a sense, the beauty of Apple's design made us forget about it, right? And because we forgot about it, engineering in principle over the past 30, 40 years has allowed the design to matter first and forget about looking behind the hood. And I think now's the time to start looking underneath the hood and making the question why be the biggest question you ask in everything you do.
I do want to add one more thing, though, which is, it's not to say that there aren't principles. Like, we don't have to come up with this stuff, from ground zero, right? So there's a woman I know, really cool woman named Astrid Chow, who works at IBM Watson Health, and she's actually working on best practices around IBM Health, right, and around AI. And so they're looking at the Hippocratic Oath. They're looking at bioethics principles. They're looking at the American Statistical Association. I mean, they're looking at those kinds of principles that are out there in the world and thinking, instead of coming up with a whole new AI world, how can we actually just adapt the world that we live in to the new technology?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, Michelle, I want to ask you a quick question around the chatbot, about the Trollbusters chatbot. To me, it was an extension of taking what you had probably a ton of people doing, right? Mm-hmm. And creating a chatbot in order to get out to more people with less people working on it, right? Just-in-time education.
It was really more about the speed. that
about
we
the
wanted people to be able to get the information that they needed when they needed it.
Right.
Because for women journalists and journalists of color, the speed of these attacks and how fast they can devolve and have smart mobs that are coming after them is a very different dynamic than a one-off troll. And so we needed to build in an element of speed, and that bot allows us to be able to get the information out to people when they need it. I want to flip the script because we've talked about kind of the bad, design gone bad. And I want to look at an example actually from my world here, which could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. Revenge porn. So you have naked pictures, you've taken them of your boyfriend, girlfriend, girlfriend, etc., partner, and somehow it makes it up on social media. You've broken up and now they put it on social media. So revenge porn is the exposure of those intimate images using social media. Well, what they just come out with is a team that's working on, you upload your naked pictures. The AI is trained and the image itself is recognized and marked in a way that if that image is attempted to be uploaded from another location, the AI recognizes that this is a duplicate image that's been submitted by you as a protected image and therefore won't allow the image to be posted. Okay, so that's a way in which we kind of flip the script by being proactive and getting those images out someplace. My fear,
It's going to be hacked.
it's going to be hacked. And then we will just have clouds of naked pictures that you've put up there. So it can be wielded for good or evil. And so I want us to think about just the fact that what seems like a good idea to me seems fraught with other dangers as well in terms of exposing those things to a cloud environment that isn't very secure, especially when we do have our credit card companies and our major corporations being hacked, where data about us is being aggregated all over the place. We can identify you in those pictures, even if you're not, because we got you all over Facebook.
Yeah,
We recognize your picture every time somebody else uploads it. Oh, do you mean so-and-so? Let's tag them. Well, you're training the AI to recognize you whether you have clothes on or not. Okay?
that's a crazy example.
Sorry.
Am I blushing?
my
That's just the
mind.
Irish in me. I probably am blushing. I can see so many issues with that. It kind of like reminds me of, Susan, your example with the kangaroo, right? Like here were designers that maybe didn't think through all the different perspectives of it. Can you go, building off what Michelle has said, how can we teach AI to pay attention to what's not there instead of maybe having to upload everything to the cloud, which has fraught with issues?
Yeah, I mean, you just need, this is where you guys come in, right? I mean, you just need people who come from diverse backgrounds, diverse cultures. And somebody on Twitter a couple days ago said this wonderful thing, and I can't remember for the life of me what her name is, but she said, it's not really like diversity. Diversity isn't really a thing. It's just reality. It's just, this is the world we live in. These are we're all our people. And so the important thing here is, when you think about, and I'm going to overgeneralize, so please forgive me for this, but I'm going to hypergeneralize here. When you have companies like Google and Microsoft and Facebook and Amazon that are like 80%, young white guys, under the age of 30, then you're going to have systems that are optimized for that. I'm not saying in a judgmental way that that's a bad thing. I'm just simply saying that does not reflect the diversity and the kind of spectrum of the world that we live in. It means that some people will be left behind. This is also true, by the way. I had this conversation with somebody who was in Helsinki last week, and we were talking about, and she's like, and Helsinki is about one of the most homogeneous places you could possibly go. But here's their issue. If you go to Google Translate to translate the word for woman into Finnish, the word for woman in Finnish I learned is naimen, N-A-I-M-E-N. And then if you start looking at the synonyms, excuse me, bronchitis. If you start looking at the synonyms for woman, you know what the synonyms are? Servant, housekeeper, cleaning lady, prostitute, because they don't have enough Finnish speakers to have enough data to be able to reflect the language with the accuracy that we can do in English, because we have so much more data in English. So think about this. Think about the value of one more group of Finnish people. Think about the value of one more Australian. Think about the value of more people coming into, or of different ages, whatever it might be, coming into a group, rural accents, whatever it might be, coming into a group and saying, in fact, Alexa has this problem. Any of you have trouble, if you have, if you have a strong accent, and if you have trouble having Alexa or any of these other tools understand you, yeah. So, you need to be on those teams and helping to train those voice agents.
And just to add something to kind of, again, these brilliant ideas that are coming up, is we're talking about this idea of things we can control, reality versus things that we're never going to be able to hold back, the genie out of the bottle. There's some things in this world we can't fix, and there are some things we can. More women, more underrepresented groups at the table. So we can't fix everything, but there are certain things that we can do. And again, just like you said, flipping the script, it's not always so binary. So in Rwanda, they had a genocide in 1994. 10% of the population is decimated. Guess what percentage of the parliament is now women? 60%, right? In a place that you wouldn't necessarily consider progressive in that type of socioeconomic and political space. So again, bad things happen. There are things we can't control. There are things we can control. More women at the table, more people of color at the table. So this is, again, one of the things with AI that I think if we step back is one of the huge issues. What can we control? I'm afraid of this. I'm afraid of this happening. There are certain things that are going to happen in life, whether we like it or not. But just like Susan was saying, there's some things we can do. There are certain things we can fix. Yeah. More voices at the table, because we're never going to get it all right, but we're definitely not going to get it right if we don't have enough people of enough different backgrounds kind of chiming in.
There's one more thing I want to add to that, too, which is that, this is all, like, I'm sure we're all in the room because we fundamentally agree with this idea. There's a real difference when you take it to when you try to start a company focused on it, right? So you have to figure out what is going to be my business, what's going to be my use case, how am I going to write a business plan for this, who's going to buy it, who's going to buy social justice. People don't buy social justice. But what they do buy is audience segmentation. They want to understand what tribes you guys are part of, what music you like, what things you do, what languages you speak, what clothes you wear, all those things. They want to understand that. To understand that, they need to understand a lot about the differences and the similarities among people. So, audience segmentation, ad targeting, recommendation engines, search algorithms, any app, any business that wants to make money needs to understand that we have a really broad spectrum of people in the world. And the better you understand them, and the better they understand that, as a self-disclosure, over 40 mom, I don't really want to hear, get all the ads for those weird panty things and the diet plan. I don't really want to hear that from you, Facebook. Thank you very much. I would rather hear about music and other things. The more they know about and they're supposed to know, right? The more behavior that they have from you, and again, assuming that this is done ethically and in good conscience, the better it will be from a business standpoint. So I'm not saying that it isn't just about social justice, because social justice should be a baseline expectation, but it's about business too.
Okay, well, that's good. Let me just add a quick question that was actually I had written for all of you. And you're bringing it up, Susan, in regards to social justice, because I think what's interesting here is actually there's an ongoing debate on the rise of big data and machine intelligence. Is it a privacy issue, or is it a social justice issue? Is it one or the other, or is it both? I mean, do we give all of our data over in order to better improve these systems, and they know, and everyone has a seat at the table, And so therefore, we think differently about sharing information, and there goes our privacy, and that addresses social justice, or do we, I mean, tell me, what do you think here? It's really, are they on either side of the field or what?
Now, just like many other areas, there's an intersectionality between those two areas as well as several others. My work is in digital identity and reputation management, and recognizing that the identity that's being built of each of us digitally is the reputation that you have. And that before you even get in the door for an interview, somebody's already searched your social media profiles and been able to dig up information about you. And so the danger for me is in those algorithms making decisions, pushing out information about me, keeping it circulating. The issue for me is more about who has the control. You don't have the control about how your information circulates. You don't have any control about whether it can be taken down or the right to be forgotten. That's in other countries in the EU. We don't have those controls. And so we don't have anything that allows us one place from which you get to choose who gets to see what level of your identity. And so everything is free-floating. Everything is available, and the dangers of it are rife. We have third-party aggregators that scrape all of our arrest records and take those mug shots. Well, they take those mug shots and they link them to the image recognition in Facebook. And when you're Googling somebody's name, those ads pop up and you see that name and that face and you automatically recognize, you don't even get the interview. And so there's really deep problematic issues. How many people in here, you guys are probably too young for Minority Report. How many people have seen Minority Report? Okay, so a couple people in the room. When we have the predictive technologies in place that are attempting to decide before we've even done something whether we're good or we're bad, insurance, our finances, many aspects of our lives are driven by these algorithms in a way that we have no idea or control over the information that's being shared about us. And I think that really, for me, is the crux of the issue. Not that we don't have privacy or it's one or the other. We don't have choice over that privacy and what we give, except by choosing to go online or off, and in very minute ways on the platforms themselves that we have to jigger the filters to be able to try and protect ourselves. But there's no overarching way that we can retract that and say, nope, it's all protected, it's inside my little bubble right now, and you can't have access to it. It's like it's gone out into the wild, and it's there, and it exposes you. I wanted to go, we'll talk about it later, but those two AIs and language, I deal a lot in language as well as memes and images because two different things. Our AI is not really, it's getting more sophisticated on the images, except you've heard examples of where those images don't work. And the ways that language is mutable. It's always changing, it's always dynamic. And so in my work, people say, well, you know, Google is working on Jigsaw and they've got AI and they'll be able to solve that problem. But language is always changing and morphing. Think about how we shorten words for our texts. Think about the alt words that we use to be able to speak with our friends, but other people who are on the out group don't know that word. All of those kinds of things come into language. So I'm actually fascinated by the fact that the bots learned a separate language because maybe our problem is our language. And we might learn faster if we learned a different language and be able to express ourselves differently if we learned a different language. So I actually find that really fascinating. Maybe we need to learn a new language in order to be able to have a more inclusive language that we've designed.
I think that's, as you were talking, of course, I'm like thinking more ideas based on the brilliant ideas you said. I think this is an amazing, obviously nuanced question. So sometimes in the law, when we think about privacy, we do think about it at odds with the public interest. But what Michelle so brilliantly just said about this idea, of course, it's not binary and they're intersectional. And then you talked about this idea of choice. So kind of what all of my work in international human rights, from working on war crimes and genocide issues to working domestically, kind of what brought me to become a social entrepreneur was not because I wanted to necessarily have the title of being a social entrepreneur, but because what I've understood from conversations I've had all around the world is that people want agency and autonomy over their own lives, and they want to make their own choices on their own terms. things like humanitarian aid are life-saving. Helping people is incredible. But the truth is no one saves anyone else. The thing we can do is say, how can I help you make these choices on your own terms? Because people know what they want. It's just like you said, this lack of awareness or transparency or the ability to be empowered to understand what's happening to you. And that's, for me, what social justice is. It's not me telling you what's just for you. It's saying, injustice, just like MLK said, injustice that happens to you, it happens to me, it affects all of us. But when it comes to building, I decide what I get to do with my life, and you get to decide what you do with your life. So I think it has to do with this idea of choice. And that helps brings these disparate ideas of privacy, public concerns, kind of to the fray. Choice, autonomy, and agency. And it's very complicated, but that's what I think about.
Yeah, and that's totally true. And it's also like really culturally dependent. So like in China, there's really no concept of privacy the way that it exists here. And in Europe, it's much more intense. There's a law you may have heard of coming into, that's going to be beginning to be enforced in May of 2018 called GDPR in the European Union. It stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. And the whole point of this law is essentially to give control of data back to what they call, because they're a government thing, the data subject. That basically means people, the person about whom the person the data describes. So the whole point is like you have the right to be forgotten. If you stop using an app, that data is not going to sit around in the cloud forever. If you should have the ability to control where your data goes. I bet you there's not a single person in this room who could take a piece of paper and write down every single bit of data that your phone is now sending about you and know for sure every single thing that's happening right now. Yes, you know it geolocates you. If you're tweeting, it knows all that. It knows what cell tower you've pinged on the way over. Like it knows all those things, but there's so many other things you don't know that are happening in the background, like Erin's first story.
It's listening.
And by the way, the stuff that Michelle was talking about, all the stuff that's being collected about you and inferred about you, a lot of it is wrong. Yeah. I mean, so
you don't know me.
You don't know that. So I love this story. This is like a 10-year-old story, but it's still so good. So there was this guy who was applying for a job, and he didn't get, and what happens is it turns out that he didn't get the job, and it was because there was this tool that was being marketed that would go through social media and would discover kind of things about, it was being marketed to HR departments. And they basically, if they bought it, then they'd find out about candidates' social media history and stuff like that. So it comes back about this guy that he talks about drugs all the time. He talks about meth, he talks about coke, he talks about heroin, constantly, all the time. And so he doesn't get hired. He was a journalist. He had a drug beat. That's what his job was. It couldn't even tell the difference between somebody who talks about something socially and somebody who talks about it because, oh, by the way, here's an article that I wrote about what's happening, with meth. So, I mean, these kinds of things happen every single day. I think this idea of privacy, honestly, it's so personal, and I think a lot of times, I'm a little older than a lot of you guys, a lot older than a lot of you guys. The idea of privacy, I don't think people think about it the same way. It's just kind of what it is, right? But the reality is, it doesn't mean you don't want to control who has what about you, right? You want to at least have a say, right? You may not care as much about some things, but you want to at least have a say. But I think there's really neat opportunity, and I'm kind of begging you here. So I'm going to make one plea, which is that a lot of this mess that we're in is because all the early business models on the internet were advertising based. They're all attention based. This is the attention economy, right? Attention is the currency. Ethan Zuckerman is the guy who actually is the name of the guy who actually came up with that first flashing ad. I forget what it's called. The really ugly early ones. He he's apologized for this. He's apologized.
He runs the Center for Civic Media
yeah.
now.
He's apologized for this. So my plea to you is this: business models that are not based on advertising, go.
Okay, this is great. So we want to open up the floor to you. Hopefully some of you have some questions. We'll start here in the audience. Does anyone want to ask a question to the panelists? Don't be shy. Get a seat at the table.
Hi, I'm Salvi. I'm a master's student in computer science. And my question is kind of where artificial intelligence meets social media. So last semester, I did a project about fake news. And we realized that a huge problem or a proponent of fake news was social media. And the creation of these echo chambers where people just keep sharing what is recommended to them. And it kind of like, it just reflects upon their own bias, but they don't know that a world exists outside their own bias. So I'm kind of playing the devil's advocate here. My question to you is it, how ethical is it for, like, we discussed it's not ethical for recommendation engines to completely invade our privacy and keep directing us towards a certain source or area. But social media platforms are kind of modeled like a democracy. And if we intervened, if we stopped people, if we censored or filtered what kind of content people were accessing, would that be wrong? Would that be counterintuitive to our own argument?
So fake news, the F news word, it still keeps cropping up. I think the issue of fake news is a red herring, because what we're talking about is people putting out information. Some of it's misinformation, some of it's disinformation, some of it's purposefully misdirecting people's thoughts and ideas. Well, the issue that you talk about is really the one of homophily, that like people flying together, birds of a feather, the ways in which the technologies recommend. I thought, you know, as we looked at this issue and the echo chambers that are definitely real, and we can see the red feeds and the blue feeds fed same story, different headlines, different context, and all of a sudden the facts are morphed into two different realities. So when we think about recommendation, why not have tools that actually diversify our stream? How many of you have actually looked at your friend feed to see how many people that don't look like you are in your friend feed? Do you know? Check it out. I thought it'd be really interesting if Facebook put in a little feature, diversify your tribe, and helped you look at and identify based on the demographics of your friend group. People that are different from you, that have different religious backgrounds, different sexual orientations, come from different parts of the country, etc. And you'd have two parallel feeds. Because we learn when we are juxtaposed, our ideas are juxtaposed against something different that jogs us out of our own complacency. And right now, the way the tools are designed are for recommendation, consistently, homophily, trying to churn out a marketplace of similar kinds of people. And so it's not going to show us things that are different than ourselves. So I think we need to just look at how we can design for our blind spots and our biases.
You want to go ahead?
Just to quickly say, I was going to say something very similar, not surprisingly, I had a similar idea, but I think what you're saying, to distill it down, is instead of filtering our filters, how do we become aware of our filters and then counteract that with positive forces, right? So this is exactly how you answered the question. And of course, not surprisingly, I had a similar idea. Well, what if we had a way to, instead of filtering the filters, say, I want to see opinions that are like proactively decide. You want to seek out conversations, discussions with people that are different than you. I had 3 of those already today since I've arrived in this wonderful place. And you have to be proactive. So there's no filtering the filter. There's no such thing as the blank slate, but there's being aware and saying, I actively want to seek things that are different from who I am. And not just that, but to approach it with a curiosity and an openness, so that we move away from the binary debates and more towards the, I'm really curious. I might not understand. I might even be asking the wrong questions, but I truly want to understand your point of view, which is essentially what you just said.
Yep, I agree with all of that. And just to add one more thing about business models, because I'm going to flog this until you take me off the stage, which is that Facebook is built on the premise that we pick presidents and friends the same way that we pick shoes and cars and music. And here's the deal, like, I love your shoes. Where did you get your shoes? I love your shoes. I want to buy them. I love those shoes. But that's not a way to run a democracy, right? That's not a way to run a democracy. So these are two different issues. There's the stuff we buy, and sometimes and I do want to know, and those of you guys who are like bicyclists or motorcycle riders, like you want to be hooked into the people who, or you have a particular music taste, you want to be hooked into the people who share that exact precise aesthetic that you have. But that's not good for you as a person when you think about it in terms of politics and like living in the world. And so that's kind of back to my plea to you about like, let's stop thinking about everything as ad targeting. Because when you think about everything as ad targeting, then you end up with red feed, blue feed, and all that kind of stuff. And we end up not being able to understand each other at all. So I'm off my rant now.
Right here.
So I was wondering, with the filter bubble situation, do you think that there's a chance that maybe possibly we're creating like a false reality for ourselves? Like we see on social media what we want to see because we tell it what we want to see?
I think it's a reinforcing narrative. We live out, as humans, we're storytellers. We're like human storytellers. You walk up to somebody, you tell them a story of what happened to you yesterday. We tell stories all the time. We are creating and manifesting through these filters the stories that we're going to live out of. And so if your feed looks like everybody that's like you, that had a background like you and everything else, you're going to think that's the way the world should look. And being able to break out of that requires effort on your part. Physical, going to different places in physical space, eating different food, trying different things, experimenting, making different kinds of friends to understand those types of things. So absolutely.
How many of you have ever unfollowed a friend on Facebook? Right. I have debates with my friends about this because I've never unfollowed a friend. And I think those that raised your hand, you're helping to design your filter bubble. You're creating that filter bubble by actually unfollowing someone, especially if you start critically thinking about why you unfollowed them. Did you disagree with them? Did you not like what they had to say? Did they post something that you found inappropriate? It's better to actually, in my opinion, that's just my opinion, it's better to actually keep following them and engage them in conversation than shut it down before it's happened.
I didn't unfriend them because of their points of view. So maybe that's a little bit different.
Yeah.
Maybe some other reason, but
yeah,
definitely.
So is there any way to envision sort of more of the kind of nuts and bolts of how an algorithm is developed or decided? So I'm just thinking, I saw this really great presentation a couple of years ago about emojis. And this woman actually showed a room of like the International Emoji Council. I mean, it was an actual photo, and it was all these guys. And it was unbelievable. I mean, there was an actual group of people who were deciding the emojis that you get on your phone. And so I'm wondering, is there any way to imagine a specific, or we have an example of a specific technology that's created and kind of how that process works and how these biases then get built in?
Yeah, I can walk through it, but before that, I'm gonna just share something super inappropriate, which is that the big issue that they're focused on right now is how many poo emojis there should be. Poo. Yeah. They're focused on, like, there's smiling pile of poo. Should there be frowning pile of poo? Like, seriously, there's a whole, you gotta Google it. It's a really good, it's terrible, but it's really.
Look at how long it took for them to develop emojis that had skin colors that were representative of our population.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Look at how long it took for them to recognize, oh, wait, everybody doesn't have a hand that looks like that. And let's design for that. And so I think when you're talking about, designing these systems, a real simple example I'll give really quickly. I know you said it. Students working in social media, you're putting together keywords, hashtags, et cetera, and monitoring systems to be able to see what you see out there. Hopefully using Boolean operators to create deep phrases of things that you're searching for in your search phrases. I have my students doing that in social media class where we're looking at 22 counties in southeastern Ohio. I said, what are the words that you're using? Look at the language, look at the words. What are other alt words that might be used by this community? Deepen your understanding. Like, I can't see anything in my monitor. Don't tell them I said that. Can't see anything in my monitor. Well, look at how you're pulling information. What kind of information, first of all, is coming through from the pipelines in terms of what's being represented? So is it Twitter? Is it Facebook? Well, who's on those platforms? So you already got bias built into the data. Then you're also creating filters and code basically through what you're asking it to search for. I said, who might not be using those platforms? What are the words that you're using that somebody doesn't say it that way? You're already baking in bias to what you're seeing and then say, I don't see it there, it must not exist. No, you're not seeing it because you're not looking for it. So that's just a real small example.
So anybody bake sourdough bread? You need like a starter. So you kind of need a starter with training an algorithm. So I'll tell you a story. So this is about training images, which I think is one of the easiest ones to understand. So, you basically take in like all these photographs, hundreds of thousands of photographs. And depending on what kind of learning model you use, one is called supervise, where you tag and say, this is a person, those are shoes, that's a chair, this is a floor, that is a ceiling, that's a fluorescent light, etc. And then it keeps looking for things like that. Then there's something called deep learning, where it basically looks at everything that's the same and it infers what it is. Deep learning is typically used for training image sets. So here's a story from the early days that I heard from somebody who was at IBM, who said that in the early days of training IBM Watson on images, Watson thought dogs were people. And they were like, well, why does it think dogs are people? Remember, it's a black box, so you can't say, Watson, why do you think dogs are people? So you have to dig into the data model. You have to look at the data to see if you can find the answer. So they're digging and digging and digging, and all of a sudden they start realizing that most of the photos that they have of dogs are in the context of a family. So it's mom and dad. I'm just going to give you your basic nuclear family here, right? Mom, dad, brother, sister, dog. Well, families are made of people. Dogs are in families, therefore dogs are people. And then they had to physically say, no, different category, animal, dog, golden retriever, and then it's a kind of a sequential process from there. Now this happens, with millions of images, millions of times a second. But that's also how you get stuff like, if you Google the phrase 3 white teenagers, and then you Google the phrase 3 black teenagers, you get 3 white teenagers. It comes from Getty Images and stock photos, and they're all playing volleyball on the beach, looking super happy. 3 black teenagers not looking as happy, not in the same situation, because the sources of the data are very different. And what gets shared on the internet is very different. So that's sort of in a nutshell why this gets kind of complicated really fast.
You all probably have already been involved, obviously not only through what you put out on the internet in training AI, but you've actually been involved in training AI. So think about those CAPTCHA systems that say, I'm not a robot. And then it says, pick out the images of all the signs. Yeah. Pick out all the images of all the people. You're training the AI through that tool. Image recognition, it started out, remember it was word recognition, and then it'd say, is this, type in this word that you see on the screen. You're training the AI. So you've all probably done it.
Yeah, Google search, when it first started, was a game. And we would sit there and talk with a stranger and try actually coding and helping to build that search engine. So I think that's the biggest thing I've learned from building AI models is it takes a lot of people to train these models. And so I guess the best thing is it takes a village, right? And let's make sure that village is very diverse in making sure that we actually build the right type of models and leaving them transparent and open so that we can continue to teach them. It sounds like a lot of them that are currently built are closed. And it's, when do we stop learning? We're about lifelong learning, so why wouldn't we want the machines to be lifelong learners too? So we've come to our close. This went by very fast. I want to thank the panelists, Flynn, Michelle, and Susan. Thank you for your participation.
You're honored to be here. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you for coming. And please, we look forward to seeing you early morning for the hackathon and at 8 o'clock. Let us know if you want to join, if you've just joined today and said, man, I need to be there the next 48 hours. There's always room for you. Have a good night.